Why are some of the Denver Broncos' pending free agents still available on the free agency market? And does that give the Broncos leverage to bring in some of these key names like the Melvin Gordons, the Kareem Jacksons, the Bryce Callahans back into the mix? You get that and much more in today's brand new episode, Locked on Broncos.
You are Locked on Broncos, your daily Denver Broncos podcast. Part of the Locked on Podcast Network. Your team every day.
What's up, Broncos country? Welcome back into a brand new episode of Locked on Broncos, your daily Denver Broncos podcast here on the Locked on NFL Network, your team every day. From the South Stands to the end zone, I'm your host, as always, Cody Rourke, joined alongside by my co-host, Sarah Bettinger. Both of us, we cover the Denver Broncos for the Locked on Network and 9 News. Sarah writes about them with Predominantly Orange. I write about them with Pro Football Network. Thank you so much, Broncos country, for making us your first listen of the day every single day for all your Denver Broncos news, content, and coverage. You can get this podcast free and available everywhere you listen to your podcast in audio format. You can watch us here in high definition here on YouTube, on your TV, on your computer, or your smartphone. We appreciate you so much. Hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications if you haven't done so already. Sarah, my friend, hey, look, as we continue to roll out through the NFL offseason, things that are approaching the Broncos, the NFL draft, we obviously offseason workouts begin next week for the team as they report back to the team facility for off-season conditioning. That's always exciting to get guys back in and around the building. Then we're getting into the whole conversation piece about, like, could the Broncos still make some free agency moves? We have to look at it from the standpoint, too, of some Broncos, former Broncos from last year that are still free agents. Does this help the Broncos getting leverage and maybe getting them back? So let's first off take a look at the offensive side of the ball with some free agents that, were on the offensive side last year that are still available.
Absolutely. I think this is, if we compare free agency to waves, right? We've had the first wave, we've had the second wave, we've probably even had the third, fourth, and fifth waves. And now you can see your reflection perfectly in the water. It's like, that's how dead it is right now in terms of NFL news, free agency wise happening. So Melvin Gordon, though, Cody, I think is the highest paid player that the Broncos have on their list of guys that is still available for anybody to sign. And frankly, I was kind of curious about what the situation with him might be when we saw him chumming with Nathaniel Hackett. Remember that? At Nathaniel Hackett's introductory press conference, the photo gallery the Broncos posted, and Melvin Gordon was there. So I don't know. You can't help but wonder if the Broncos front office has watched the film of what he's done the last couple seasons. What is the factor, or maybe combination of factors, that's led to them keeping him on the open market at this point? I think there's a couple that make some sense, but man, he seemed like he was a pretty good tandem back with Javonte Williams.
Well, and that was the thing, too. He said, we got unfinished business, several months ago. He wants to run it back, but there's conditions attached to that apparently for Gordon. And I think this is interesting, too, because he wants to be the premier guy. He wants to get paid, and right now his market value has really dropped. And I read somewhere that he recently changed his agent, too, because I guess free agency hasn't gone how he had planned for. But now, does this really kind of force his hand and saying, you know what, I may have to accept being the guy right behind Javonte Williams? They still had equal touches, 203 carries each last season. So I don't think it's not necessarily a big deal. Like, you don't got to be the premier guy. Here's the deal. Javonte's on a rookie deal, and he's the guy that the Broncos look for the future. Melvin can still contribute and be a very big part of this offense. So I don't know. I feel like he'd be a good fit in Nathaniel Hackett's offense, kind of in terms of the styles that he provides versus Javonte. There are two different players that can both be highly utilized in the sense the way that A.J. Dillon and Aaron Jones were in Green Bay. But then there's another offensive name out there too. Bobby Massey, offensive tackle. Look, the Broncos, they went out and they got Billy Turner. They got Tom Compton. They have Calvin Anderson. So they really went out with these three right tackles, some guys that are younger and also a veteran, option that's probably a little bit more proven in Billy Turner than Bobby Massey. But, going back to even like that, like Bobby Massey last year for the Broncos was super solid for them. In terms of, we talk about solidarity at right tackle, he's about the most solid right tackle the Broncos have had in many, many years. So we did like to see his contribution there. I honestly don't think that he'll be back with the team. I think that's kind of settled now with obviously the Compton addition, Calvin Anderson coming back, and now obviously with Billy Turner. It just seems very hard for a guy like Bobby Massey to come back. But there is a veteran tight end option that was a pretty significant player for the Broncos, not just on offense in terms of the blocking department, but also on special teams last year.
Yeah, Eric Saubert. He was a kind of a training camp riser for the Broncos, and I know we changed coaching staffs and everything, but Man, I feel like he was one of those guys that kind of like with Andrew Beck, like maybe you project him a little bit of a better weapon for your offense, even with a better quarterback. And I know we've heard all the stuff on Twitter. Russell Wilson doesn't utilize the tight end as much and yada yada, but man, you still got to have guys that can go out there and block. And I know the Broncos did bring in Eric Tomlinson to help block at the tight end position, but Eric Saubert is a guy that I feel like, man, he could have really added to your depth, at least on your 90-man roster. And I don't hate that the Broncos are going to the NFL draft to look to this position, which I think they do need to. At this point, I was a huge proponent of them landing somebody in free agency, and they didn't really do that outside of Tomlinson, obviously. So I think with Eric Saubert, it's kind of a surprise. And those other special teams guys that the Broncos acquired last year, they aren't really bringing those guys back. So maybe they didn't like what they saw from them in that phase of the game, even though, Saubert is a guy who's willing to do that, willing to play that kind of role and be one of those guys on your 53-man roster. That's just, we can rely on this guy for quite a few important things.
For Dwayne Stukes, the new special teams coordinator for Denver, I imagine he's probably gone back and he's watched film on special teams. And I imagine if Saubert is somebody that stood out to him, there might be an inquisition to say, hey, let's bring him in to compete at training camp. Because right now you do have Andrew Beck as that fullback hybrid tight end option. You have Alberto, who's kind of considered to be penciled in as that number one guy. And then Eric Tomlinson, like tight end is still, an area of concern for Denver to add more guys. We'll see whether they do that in terms of maybe bringing Saubert back or maybe even going out there and getting somebody in this year's NFL draft. And maybe a Jelani Woods out of Virginia, like we talked about, the all-RAS elite tight end there. But I'll be very intrigued to see what George Paton does here. I mean, it's like the Broncos have the leverage here because obviously the market for these players has not been maybe what some of them have anticipated. There's another veteran offensive tackle too that, we were kind of wondering, is he taking up a roster space last season? That's Cam Fleming, still a backup free agent right now, still available out there. And as we saw too, there were times where he came in and it's like, okay, hey, maybe this is exactly why they had him in, because he was playing a little bit more reliable as a tackle option when some guys got hurt. And I mean, what more could you ask for there?
Right. And I think with as few teams as have solidified offensive lines at this point, I mean, I feel like the Broncos have 10 guys they could take into the regular season this weekend if there were a game. But I mean, not every team around the NFL has the kind of depth that the Broncos have on the offensive line right now. So for guys like Bobby Massey and Cam Fleming to still be sitting there as free agents when you could probably sign them for less than $4 or $5 million, I mean, that just really seems odd to me. I mean, this free agent market has been very slow going after the flurry of moves right away. And now it's been just super, super slow going. So I hope for these guys, they're able to land another gig somewhere else, Cody, because those guys did some good work last season for the Broncos. Maybe a different scheme is what they need. But man, I feel like there's a spot for them on a 53-man roster somewhere.
Why should it be important that the Broncos also take a look on the defensive side of the ball with Bryce Callahan? Could he make his return to Denver? We talk about the pros and the cons, and we talk about the Broncos defensive players, I'm not sure, that are free agents that are still available, and could they return to Denver? You get that and much more coming up here in just a second. But before we do that, let me tell you about BetOnline.net, the sponsor of today's episode, Locked On Broncos. BetOnline.net is your number one source for all your sports betting needs and information, and you can find all the latest sports developments, including this week's Masters Championship odds, podcasts, and reviews for all the different leagues this season. BetOnline is your continued source for all your sport wagering information, including live betting, esports, and scores. So head to the website today or use your mobile device to learn more about the trends and the action. BetOnline, where the game starts. As we jump into the second half action on today's episode, Locked On Broncos. Once again, Broncos country, thank you so much for making us your first listen of the day. Locked On Broncos is your daily Broncos podcast that covers every angle with this football team. We look at both sides of the coin with an objective point of view, and we love the interaction we've gotten from everybody in Broncos country here on YouTube, here on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify. We appreciate you so much. Thank you for helping us grow the show in Broncos country. Talking about defensive free agents that are still available here that the Broncos could maybe look to bring back from last year, I think we got to start off probably with the top priority in a sense where we look at the Broncos maybe needing more depth and more options there. Bryce Callahan, in my opinion, Sarah, and I know you put this in the show notes too, like it's super surprising to me that Bryce Callahan is still available when there are so many teams out there that need a really good nickel cornerback. And I understand maybe a lot of the concerns from some of these teams has to do with the injury history there, but when healthy, we've raved about it here on the show. He is an impact player on the Broncos defense, one of the best corners in the league on the interior when healthy. And I think right now, I mean, if the Broncos really want to bring back Bryce, I think the market value in terms of where it's at now, how it's been set from other deals and other teams, Denver's got a really good chance to entice him to come back. And part of me believes that he wants to come back to Denver as well. I know one thing that he had said is that I want to be back, but it has to be at a price that's fair to me and also to the team. So where's that middle ground? That to me is, I think, is a big question.
And that's the question that probably any team that's considering him is asking. And maybe they heard the initial asking price and they're like, oh, we'll kind of wait this one out. We'll kind of wait and see what happens here, because all the other teams around the league that need nickel corners, I mean, they're signing other guys, which seems super
Younger
odd,
guys
doesn't it?
too.
I mean, young, yeah. I mean, it's so weird to see Bryce Callahan still out there with Ed Donatel going to a new team. I mean, Brandon Staley, they could definitely demote Michael Davis and put Asante Samuel Jr. on the outside and put Callahan in the slot now with JC Jack. I mean, you just go through these list of options and you kind of like, why is he still available? Even the Broncos chose K'Wan Williams over him up to this point. So it's very, very interesting to me. One of the things Vic Fangio has said, I know it didn't work out for him as the head coach, but one thing that he said that really made a lot of sense to me, that resonated, is that there's 96 cornerback spots, basically starting cornerback spots in the NFL with how much teams play in the nickel. 96 spots. And you're telling me at this point, it's April, early April, and Bryce Callahan doesn't have a team. I mean, if health is a question mark, that should drive the price down enough to the point that the team is comfortable with it. Or maybe you structure a contract to where it fits your budget or whatever. But man, I feel like it's most surprising to me that he's still available, given the fact that there's 96 starting gigs available in the NFL, and there's certainly not 96 capable players, in my opinion, at this point. And that's what his point was. There's not 96 guys out there to fill those spots. So I feel like
Yeah.
Bryce Callahan still being available is probably the biggest surprise to me at this point.
If George Paton were find a way to bring him back, I would just say, hey, that just puts a cherry on top of this offseason for Denver. One thing, too, that I do know, Justin Simmons has told George Paton, like, hey, I'd love for Bryce to be back. And I think it's obviously going to be a decision that's mutual on behalf of the Broncos and on behalf of Bryce Callahan. There has to be that mutual interest there. And we'll see, hey, they could just figure out a way to play it. And maybe Bryce Callahan's just waiting. Maybe the Broncos have put in an offer for him, and maybe he's just testing his options. Like, you don't have to make a decision right now in April, especially with the NFL draft coming up. That could change, a lot of maybe potential ideas where a guy wants to go, because let's say you sign somewhere and they go and they draft a young guy. It's like, okay, why did you even sign me then? Because now I have to worry about this young guy, a guy who's younger, maybe a little bit fresher coming in. There's that situation. Another cornerback too, Kyle Fuller. This one, I don't know. I feel like for me, looking at his season last year in Denver, it was extremely disappointing. I think we all had higher expectations of Kyle Fuller. I'm not sure if it was what the Broncos were asking him to do, what Vic Fangio was asking him to do. We thought because of the fact that he had a career year with Vic Fangio in 2018, that maybe reuniting with him in 2021 would have helped out. But, he got beat too many times, and he allowed opposing wide receivers to break his cushion. I'm not surprised right now that maybe he's not a high option for some other teams based on the fact that he's still available. But also, like, even at the NFL trade deadline, we're saying, hey, are the Broncos going to trade Kyle Fuller? No team called looking into Kyle Fuller. Teams are calling and looking into Bryce Callahan, which was a little bit more interesting. So, yeah, I'd say it was surprising, but I'm also not surprised that right now he's not with the team. I think that he's one of those moves now. A team closer to training camp says, hey, we need some veteran guys here. Let's sign this guy and let's bring him in for camp and see what it is. But I'd say outside of that too, Sarah, there's probably one more guy that's a little bit more intriguing. And, he makes these dinosaur sounds when he's on the football field. Alexander Johnson's still available.
He is. And now that the Broncos have moved Baron Browning to the edge, I mean, we don't know if that's necessarily going to be his full-time position or if it's going to be a part-time thing where he kind of floats between both. But as of right now, your starting inside linebacker duo could be the same as it was to open last season. And we've heard George Paton talk about, Josie Jewell was the glue guy, but he also had really good things to say about Alexander Johnson as well. So I know Alexander Johnson is going to be 31 on Christmas Eve this year. So that obviously does play a factor in probably his market, the fact that he's going to be 31 in 2022. But at the same time, he didn't get his NFL start until way later than most guys. So there's not as much wear and tear on his body. I just feel like it, again, with the coaching connections around the league, we saw the Minnesota Vikings go after Jordan Hicks, and they could have easily signed Alexander Johnson to go with Ed Donatel. So very surprising to me, again, that he's still available. And again, another guy that I would say, hey, you want to come back to the Denver Broncos on a 1-year deal, play about for the same price as you were last season, I would not be opposed to that at all, and pair him up with Josie Jewell again and see if those guys can be a good duo in 2022.
Well, what about Full Metal Jack, Kareem Jackson? What's the story with him and the Broncos? We're going to dive into that in a little bit more coming up here in just a moment. But first, let me tell you, if you love listening to Locked On Broncos and you're a Colorado sports fans, well, guess what? You got to be checking out the Locked On Rockies podcast. With baseball starting up again, Paul Holden has you covered with all the Rockies news and coverage that you need. You like Avalanche coverage? Well, Chris Maselli of Locked On Avalanche has you covered. And you love Denver Nuggets coverage, especially with the playoffs coming up and the Nuggets needing to secure a spot with a couple games remaining against the Grizzlies and the Lakers. Check out Adam Mares and Matt Moore at the Locked On Nuggets podcast today. The Locked On Podcast Network is connecting Colorado sports fans with the teams that they root for. As we jump into the fourth quarter action on today's episode of Locked On Broncos, thank you so much once again, Broncos Country, for making Locked On Broncos your first listen of the day every single day. Sarah, the Broncos really have a lot of holdover defensive free agents still available here, and we're going to get to a few. First off, let's talk about Full Metal Jack, Kareem Jackson. He's still available at this point, and he's been playing, at a high level at the safety position the last 2 seasons. Now, for him, I know he's been dealing with some back stuff. I know that he's taken this offseason to really rest and recover. But, for example, you look at his on-field play right next to Justin Simmons, man. I mean, outside of a couple of miscommunications they had early on in the season, they were one of the NFL's top safety duos in the entire league. He is still available. Share your thoughts on that. And then let's talk about another linebacker. I mean, the Broncos have a lot of guys there as is, but, what options do the Broncos have right now with some of these guys?
Yeah, Kareem Jackson still being available. I guess with the way the safety market has been, we've kind of talked about this on the show in the past. Like the safety
Yeah.
market seems to be very, very odd. So I know Kareem Jackson is older, but it does seem kind of like he found the fountain of youth when he switched to that safety position. And that's something that a lot of times, like with older corners, people will suggest that like on Twitter or wherever, and they'll say, oh, well, why not try him out at safety? Obviously, you don't have to, I guess they think that at safety, you don't have to do quite as much as you do at the cornerback
Safety's
position
tough.
in terms of safety is tough. Cody knows firsthand. So I think that obviously he did find the fountain of youth playing safety, especially with Justin Simmons. They were a great duo together. And like you said, if Justin is campaigning for Bryce Callahan to come back, I wonder what he's saying about Kareem Jackson, because those two guys have been working together for the last 3 years and they communicate well. I wonder if it's Ejiro Evero wanting more younger guys, or if the team really believes in Caden Stearns. I wish they would just come out and be black and white about it and say, we want Caden Stearns to be the starting safety next to Justin Simmons, or we really like Caden and Jamar Johnson, another 5th round pick from last year's draft, which I think all of us were surprised he fell to the 5th anyway. So there's some young guys there, but it's still very interesting, isn't it? I mean, the market is low for these guys. So, and then like you said, at the linebacker position, even with the coaching connections on this staff, with Ejiro Evero coming over from the Rams, Kenny Young still out there as a free agent, and the Broncos now have kind of they brought in Alex Singleton instead of just bringing back a guy like Kenny Young. So that's kind of another move that just kind of like it's the thumbnail of it's the thumbnail of this video, right? It's like, what the heck is going on? Like what is their reasoning? What is their strategy? I'd love to have another press conference from George Payton and have the opportunity to ask him some of these questions that are non-Russell Wilson related, because we know he's been getting grilled about that plenty so far this offseason.
Well, let's kind of close out today's episode of the show with two edge rushers. I mean, we've brought up Stephen Weatherly. Like, if the Broncos really need a solid veteran presence as an edge rusher, and considering that Randy Gregory underwent a shoulder operation, obviously he'll be fine, arthroscopic, minimally invasive. He should be ready to go for the start of the season. Just something to monitor there. But like, if you have one of these guys that goes down, I mean, we're still talking about the NFL draft in a couple of weeks. That do the Broncos grab an edge rusher that's a premium guy that could start for them at some point? Are you going to get a player that has the potential to do that? Well, if not, you need to take a look at a guy like Stephen Weatherly, who came in and did a fantastic job for the role that he had played in this Broncos rotation for them last season. And then it kind of bodes the question too about Malik Reed. Like, I don't believe he's signed in terms of that. The Broncos had offered, I think, a right of first refusal tender on Malik Reed, which means that, hey, if there is a team that comes in and says, hey, we want to bring in Malik Reed, the Broncos have a chance to refuse that offer and to counter it, in a sense, to bring him back. So far as we know, there's been no offers made to either of these guys just yet. So it makes the Broncos edge rusher room a little interesting, because now you have Andre Mintz, obviously, is one of those guys that we were a big, high on, especially as one of those undrafted rookie free agents. You have Randy Gregory, Bradley Chubb. The combination, you're going to see some Baron Browning, but realistically, it's kind of wide open after that. And Jonathan Cooper. I can't forget Jay Coop, man. But outside of that, it's like, hey, what do the Broncos do here?
Right. And I think the more surprising one of these two is the fact that Malik Reed was essentially kind of like Philip Lindsay last year. It was the same type of deal. Like, the Broncos they ultimately rescinded Philip Lindsay's offer. But even prior to that, other teams could call him and make an offer. And I feel like if you could make Malik Reed an offer, he's proven over the last couple years, I mean, he can start. I mean, he's not going to be necessarily an elite edge defender, but he's a capable starter as a former undrafted player. So for the Broncos to only put the first right of refusal on him, instead of, remember back in the day, they were putting higher tenders on Shaquille Barrett, I think that it's very fascinating that no team has come after Malik Reed, given his versatility, given his starting experience, his age. Nobody's come after him at all. And I think he's kind of, like you said, he hasn't signed that deal yet. So he's maybe holding out that some team will come after him. But as you mentioned before, Cody, as we get closer to the NFL draft, the leverage for these players just gets smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller. And then after the draft, even smaller than that, in my opinion. So it's just, the urgency's got to be ramping up for these free agents that are still available. And these players that, I mean, their roles in Denver, they could be there, maybe not. It's very, very interesting to see this many guys. I thought the Broncos would have more guys come off the board earlier in free agency, but here we are, and we're talking about at least probably 10 guys that are still out there and available.
Well, it'll be interesting to see how things play out for these players. And obviously, if they go to another team, we just always want to wish them the best, and we appreciate their contribution to the Denver Broncos. If they return, I know that we'll be excited about what type of role that they can have going forward. But you know what I'm also thankful for, Sarah? I'm thankful for you. I'm thankful for every member in Broncos country that takes time out of their day every single day to listen to us, making us their first listen of the day, to watch us here on YouTube in 4K high definition, to get to see our funny thumbnail reactions, us posing all the time, and just having a good time interacting with everybody in Broncos country. We have Broncos fans all across the world. I mean, we have Broncos fans in South Korea that are listening. We have them all the way in different countries, Ireland, London, Mexico City. I mean, Broncos country extends beyond, and we are so grateful for everybody that takes time out of the day to listen to us. Locked On Broncos. You get us every single day, all year long, because for the true fan, there is never an off season. Well, Seb Bettinger and myself will be back tomorrow for a brand new episode of the show, Broncos Country. Let's ride.